They say the Middle Ages were remembered for knights in shining armor, towering castles, and the toll of church bells echoing across stone streets. But beneath those towers and behind those bells lay a truth far darker than the fairy tales ever dared to tell. For women, life was not a story of romance. It was a constant struggle against laws, against the weight of religion, and against punishments so cruel they sound almost unbelievable to us today. What would happen if a woman dared to speak too loudly? What if she questioned her husband's authority? Or worse, what if she was accused of sins real or imagined by neighbors or rivals? In those times, a whisper could become a weapon. A glance could be judged as guilt. And a single accusation could change the course of a woman's life forever. Tonight we step into the shadows of medieval Europe to uncover the horrifying punishments women were forced to endure. Stay with me until the end, because some of these stories were so disturbing they were erased from official history. Yet their echoes still remain. To truly understand these punishments, we must first step into the mindset of medieval Europe. A world where faith ruled every corner of life. The church was not just a place of prayer. It was the ultimate power. It dictated what people ate, what they wore, how they married, and even how they died. It claimed authority not only over the soul, but also over the body itself. For women, the expectations were carved in stone. Be silent, be obedient, and above all, be loyal. Your duty was to serve, to endure, and to remain unseen. But what happened if a woman dared to step outside that role? What if she spoke too freely, questioned her husband, or resisted the authority of priests and rulers? In those times, women were seen as fragile creatures, easily swayed, dangerously tempting, and inherently sinful. Writers of the era described them as daughters of Eve, always one step away from corruption. And so, punishments for them were not about fairness nor about justice. They were about control, about reminding every woman of her place. Picture this. You are walking through a medieval town square. The air is thick with the sound of church bells ringing, merchants shouting, and children laughing as they play in the dust. But then suddenly silence falls. Guards appear, dragging a woman into the open. Her face pale, her hands bound. The crowd gathers not out of pity but out of curiosity. Neighbors whisper, children stop playing, and strangers lean closer to see what will happen. For in this world, punishment was not hidden. It was not whispered behind closed doors. It was staged in the center of the town, under the gaze of hundreds. It was a performance of fear. Each act of discipline was meant to carve a warning into flesh, into bone, and most of all into memory, so that every person watching would leave with the same thought. Step out of line, and this could be you. One of the most humiliating punishments of the Middle Ages was reserved for something you might never expect. Gossip. Yes, something as simple as speaking too much or saying the wrong words at the wrong time. A device called the scold's bridle, or gossip bridle, was forced over the head of an accused woman. Made of heavy iron, it encased her face like a cage. Inside, a sharp piece pressed against her tongue, stabbing whenever she tried to speak. The message was cruel but clear: be silent or suffer. Can you imagine the terror? Every movement of the mouth, every attempt to form a word, became an act of pain. The very tool that gave her a voice, her tongue, was now turned against her. And this punishment wasn't carried out in secret. No, it was done in the town square, under the eyes of neighbors, family, and strangers. The woman would be paraded through the streets, the iron biting into her skin, the crowd following behind. Some laughed, some mocked. Others pointed, whispering warnings to their daughters. Because the bridle was not just about silencing one woman, it was about silencing all women. Think about it. How many words would you dare to speak if you knew a single rumor, a single complaint, or even a joke could see you wearing that cage of iron? Would you risk your voice? Or would you swallow your words, keeping every thought locked away? For the victim, it was not only her mouth that was bound. It was her spirit. Her laughter, her freedom, her very sense of self was crushed beneath the weight of iron and shame. The gossip bridle turned women into living warnings. And as villagers watched, they understood the lesson. Your words do not belong to you. They belong to those in power. Another infamous punishment was the ducking stool. At first glance, it might look almost harmless, just a wooden chair tied to a long beam. But its purpose was anything but harmless. Women accused of being witches, nagging wives, or simply disobedient were strapped tightly to the chair. Then, before the eyes of the entire town, the beam was lowered, plunging the woman into the icy waters of a river or pond. The crowd would gasp as the chair splashed into the water. Then silence until the beam was raised again. A moment of coughing, choking, desperate breath before the chair was plunged down once more. Over and over until the body weakened and the will was broken. Can you picture the terror? The cold water pressing in on every side, lungs screaming for air, the helplessness of being bound with no escape? Each time she resurfaced, she faced not mercy, but more jeers, more laughter, and another cruel descent. And here lay the most chilling irony. If she drowned, she was declared innocent. If she survived, she was guilty and punished even further. What kind of justice is that? The truth is, it was never about justice. It was about performance. The ducking stool was a spectacle staged for the community, a grim theater where fear was the script and women were the actors. Neighbors watched, children watched, husbands watched. Each plunge into the water sent a clear message to every woman in the crowd. Step out of line and this could be you. Imagine standing in that crowd. Would you dare to speak up? Or would you bow your head, whisper less, obey more just to stay safe? The ducking stool was not only a punishment of the body. It was a punishment of reputation, of dignity, of the very right to exist without fear. And long after the chair was pulled from the river, dripping and empty, its lesson lingered in the minds of all who had seen it. And perhaps the cruelest part was that the punishment didn't end at the water's edge. Even if a woman survived, she carried the shame forever. Whispers followed her through the marketplace, children pointed at her in the streets, and her name became a warning. The water may have dried, but the stain on her reputation was permanent, an invisible mark she could never wash away. Sometimes the punishment wasn't about death but about endless humiliation. In fact, humiliation was often seen as a fate worse than death itself. Women accused of adultery, theft, or even disobedience could be locked in stocks in the middle of the town square. Their hands and head were trapped between heavy wooden boards, leaving them exposed and defenseless. There they were left for hours or even days. Passers-by could spit, mock, or throw rotten food at them. Children laughed without mercy, neighbors whispered cruelly, and strangers stared as though the woman were no longer human, but a warning. Imagine the weight of that moment. Unable to scratch an itch, unable to wipe your face, unable even to look away. Every second dragged like an eternity, and the more the crowd jeered, the deeper the wound sank into her soul. Think about it. In a world where a woman's reputation was everything, public shame could destroy her life forever. A single day in the stocks meant a lifetime of whispers. Her family's name could be stained, her chances of marriage gone, her position in the community shattered. The punishment was not just physical, it was social death. A scar that could never heal. And perhaps that was the cruelest truth of all. Long after the wood was opened and the woman was free to walk away, the invisible chains of shame followed her everywhere, binding her tighter than any lock of iron ever could. And perhaps the cruelest part was this: the punishment never truly ended. Even after the stocks were removed, the whispers continued. Every time she entered the market, people remembered. Every time she passed a neighbor's door, laughter followed her like an echo. The stocks did not just bind her body for a day. They chained her reputation for a lifetime. And in a society where honor was survival, that invisible sentence could be heavier than iron and far more permanent than any wound on flesh. Another brutal fate awaited women at the whipping post. In the middle of the town square, before merchants, priests, and neighbors, women were tied to a tall wooden beam. The rope bit into their wrists, the cold wind stung their faces, and all eyes fell upon them. The flogging was not a hidden act. It was public theater designed to carve obedience not only into the woman's back, but into the hearts of everyone who watched. Every lash of the whip cracked like thunder, echoing off the stone walls, carried by the air so that no one could pretend not to hear. The lashes were meant to teach obedience, but the real lesson was fear. Not only for the woman enduring the agony, but for every wife, daughter, and servant in the crowd. The pain of one became the warning for all. And the crowd knew its role. Some watched in silence, afraid to breathe too loudly. Others muttered prayers under their breath, torn between pity and fear. And still, a few laughed, because the cruelty was not only tolerated, it was expected. Every strike of the whip carried a message. Step out of line, and this could be you. And here's the question. Was the punishment truly about the woman's so-called crime? Or was it a way for husbands, priests, and rulers to remind women of their place? To show them that their voices, their choices, even their very bodies, belonged not to themselves, but to those who held the whip. And long after the flogging ended, the scars remained etched not only into skin, but into memory. For in the Middle Ages, fear itself was the sharpest weapon of all. Perhaps the most infamous punishments of all were the witch trials. Women, often poor, widowed, or simply disliked, were accused of witchcraft. And what counted as evidence? A strange birthmark, a neighbor's jealousy, a sudden illness in the village, or sometimes just being different from everyone else. Once accused, escape was nearly impossible. Trials were not about justice, they were theater, carefully staged performances where guilt was decided long before the first word was spoken. The judges pretended to seek truth, but their minds were already made up. Imagine standing before the crowd, every whisper against you, every stare filled with suspicion. A lifetime of piety, kindness, or service meant nothing. One accusation could erase it all. Some women were hanged, their bodies left as warnings. Others were burned, flames turning them into ash as the crowd watched in silence. And many more were locked in cold dungeons, forgotten in the dark until death claimed them. But the most horrifying punishment was not always the execution itself. It was the knowledge, the constant, gnawing fear that no woman was safe. That at any moment, a quarrel with a neighbor, a child's sickness, or even a passing rumor could transform you from mother or sister into a witch. Think about it. Could you live knowing that your fate might depend on the gossip of a single jealous rival? Could you sleep peacefully, knowing that even your friends might accuse you to save themselves? The witch trials were less about witches, and more about control. They reminded women that their safety, their dignity, and even their very lives rested not in their own hands, but in the hands of those who judged them. And long after the flames burned out, the terror lingered. For the true legacy of the witch trials was not the death of the accused, but the silence of the survivors. Not every punishment left visible scars. Some were quieter, but just as cruel, designed not to break the body, but to break the spirit. Women who defied authority could be banished from their homes, exiled from their villages, or locked away in convents where the walls themselves became their prison. To lose family, community, and voice was to be erased while still alive. Imagine sitting in a cold stone cell, hearing laughter and life just beyond the barred window, yet knowing you can never take part again. Your world shrinks to silence, to whispers in your own mind, until even your name begins to fade. Isolation was not mercy, it was another kind of death. A death without fire or blade, but one that consumed slowly, leaving nothing but silence. So what do we learn from these stories? That medieval punishments were not only about crime but about control, obedience, and power. They turned women's bodies into living symbols, warnings carved into flesh and memory, reminders that silence was survival. And yet, women endured. They carried these scars, both visible and invisible, through generations, whispering their truth in ways the records never could. Every hidden tale, every broken life, became part of a legacy that refuses to be forgotten. So I ask you, when you think of the Middle Ages, do you imagine shining knights and towering castles? Or do you hear the echoes of women silenced, humiliated, and punished for simply existing outside the lines drawn for them? Because history is not only the triumphs carved in stone, it is also the suffering erased in ink. And if we forget those voices, we risk repeating the silence. If you want more stories buried in the shadows of history, subscribe and join me again, for the past still whispers, and its lessons remain.